What began as a familial estrangement has escalated into an institutional crisis that touches the very core of the monarchy. Within days, a private conflict became a national cessation. The British royal court is drawing a line, and at the center of this decision is Prince Harry. The deadline has been set, the conditions are clear, and the consequences are considered irreversible. Observers speak of a turning point that not only affects a personal fate but also redefines the crown's self-image. On January 26, 2026, evidence mounted that King Charles II had made a decision unprecedented in the modern history of the House of Windsor. The letter that reached Prince Harry in Montecito was delivered through a confidential diplomatic channel, and bore the hallmarks of institutional finality. Its contents left no room for interpretation. A clear decision had to be made within 3 days. Otherwise, a complete and irreversible break with the British royal family was imminent. The message was not public, but its impact was immediate, resonating through political, media, and social circles. According to internal sources, Lord Alderton, the King's private secretary, waited at the secure residence while Prince Harry studied the lengthy document alone. The atmosphere was described as heavy and final. It wasn't about negotiations, but about conditions. The letter defined precise steps, deadlines, and consequences. In exchange for complying with the demands, a limited return to the institutional framework was offered, but without representative duties, privileges, or symbolic functions. All of this would be under strict supervision and without any guarantee of rehabilitation. The implications of this measure extend far beyond the family circle. Within the royal household, it is understood as a constitutional necessity. The monarchy, the argument goes, cannot tolerate gray areas where titles and lineage are used outside of institutional responsibility. In this context, Prince Harry is not seen as an isolated case, but as a precedent. The decision is intended to bring clarity to a situation where ambiguity has prevailed for years. Particular attention is being paid to the roles of Princess and Sir Nigel Pembridge and Lady Eleanor Havem. This body, tasked with monitoring and evaluating compliance with royal standards, embodies the disciplinary core of the institution. Its role is not reconciliation but control. The standards are set, the review is open, and a conclusion is not guaranteed. With this, the palace is sending a clear signal. Return is not a right, but a privilege, subject to revocation. Behind the formal requirements, however, lies a deeper dimension. The letter is described by insiders as a mixture of paternal disappointment and monarchical duty. It reflects an attempt to once again separate personal ties from institutional responsibility. It is precisely this separation that makes the process so drastic. The monarchy is not acting impulsively, but calculatingly, and with its long-term stability in mind. At the same time, public pressure is mounting. Media outlets worldwide are speculating about motives, timing, and background. Critics speak of hardline advocates and of necessary consistency. Within Britain, the question is being debated whether this measure strengthens the monarchy or exposes its internal cracks. Internationally, it is understood as a signal that even familial closeness offers no protection when institutional boundaries are crossed. At the end of this first chapter, there is less of an answer than a climax. The deadline is approaching, the options are dwindling, and every decision carries irreversible consequences. For Prince Harry, this represents an existential crossroads. For the monarchy, it is a test of its own principles. Will this decision go down in history as an act of renewal or as a moment of hardening? And what does this decision say about the future of an institution struggling to maintain its balance between tradition and modernity? As the deadline inexorably draws nearer, the internal conflict intensifies into a public drama that transcends personal feelings. Prince Harry stands not only between two ways of life, but between two mutually exclusive systems. On one side is the centuries-old logic of the monarchy, characterized by duty and collective responsibility. On the other is a life consciously built outside these structures, based on self-determination, media visibility, and personal loyalty. It is precisely at this juncture that the ultimatum unleashes its full explosive force. Within the palace, it is emphasized that this is not an emotional reaction, but rather the consequence of years of escalation. Since stepping back from active royal service, Prince Harry has repeatedly made decisions that, from the institution's perspective, are considered overstepping boundaries. Publicly aired accusations, commercial projects directly linked to the royal identity, and repeated criticism of internal procedures have eroded trust. In the logic of the court, loyalty is not a feeling but a behavior. And this is precisely where those in charge see the rupture. King Charles II is thus caught in a field of tension that defines him simultaneously as a father and as a monarch. Observers describe him as someone who has long tried to find common ground without jeopardizing the institutional order. But with each new controversy, the impression grew that concessions were interpreted as weakness. The turning point came when it became clear that private mediation attempts were not bringing about lasting change. The decision to initiate formal consequences is therefore understood as an act of self-assertion by the Crown. For Prince Harry, this situation represents a twofold uprooting. On the one hand, there is the threat of losing his historical role. On the other, the realization that a return is only possible under conditions that call into question his previous life choices. The prospect of living as a prince without duties, without a public function, and under constant scrutiny seems to many like a symbolic demotion. But from the institution's perspective, precisely this restriction is necessary to restore credibility. At the same time, it becomes clear that personal loyalty and institutional loyalty are no longer compatible. The monarchy demands a clear prioritization. Gray areas in which affiliation is exploited situationally are to be definitively closed. This demand is not new, but it has rarely been formulated so uncompromisingly. Within the royal family, this is causing mixed reactions. While some see the step as long overdue, others fear that the emotional distance will deepen further. Public perception also plays a crucial role. In an era demanding transparency and authenticity, the Crown's strict stance seems outdated to some. Others see it as the very strength of an institution that doesn't succumb to the pressures of short-term moods. Prince Harry is increasingly becoming a projection screen for these sentiments. He represents the conflict between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between modern self-realization and traditional duty. The closer the ultimatum draws, the clearer it becomes that there will be no solution without loss. Every decision means saying goodbye either to one's own past or to one's current reality. The monarchy has laid out its position and signaled its resolve. Prince Harry has little room for tactical maneuvering. The choice is binary, the consequences permanent. At the end of this section, the central question crystallizes. Can a member of the royal family exist permanently outside the institution without simultaneously benefiting or damaging it? Or does this conflict demonstrate that modern individuality and the monarchical order have become fundamentally incompatible? And what does this decision mean in the long run for the fragile balance between personal freedom and the stability of one of the world's oldest institutions? With each passing day of the deadline, the focus shifts from institutional principles to the personal turmoil this decision is causing. At the heart of it all is the relationship between Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, now under unprecedented pressure, even by royal standards. What once began as a shared break with old structures threatens to morph into a crisis where loyalty, power, and survival are being renegotiated. Those close to them report that the dynamic between the two has noticeably changed. The initial unity with which previous crises were handled appears to have crumbled. While Prince Harry is increasingly described as internally conflicted, Meghan Markle is seen as strategically vigilant and focused on security. These differing reactions are intensifying the tension. A united front has transformed into a fragile alliance of convenience, its stability contingent on a decision that only one of them can make. The core of the conflict lies in the question of loyalty. For Prince Harry, loyalty is interpreted as an emotional bond, an obligation to his own family. For the monarchy, however, loyalty is inextricably linked to behavior, restraint, and institutional discipline. Meghan Markle is increasingly perceived as a symbolic figure within this tension, not necessarily as the cause of the escalation, but rather as a catalyst that reveals the boundaries between personal autonomy and royal order. Financial realities further exacerbate this situation. Following the loss of several high-profile contracts, the couple's room for maneuver has noticeably narrowed. The loss of prestige directly impacts earning potential, and without the institutional backing of the monarchy, projects lose their appeal. In this context, the ultimatum takes on a further dimension. It is not just about belonging, but about financial security and long-term prospects. Within the palace strategy, this situation is analyzed dispassionately. Without a title, without formal ties, and without symbolic capital, public influence diminishes considerably. This very effect is seen as a necessary consequence. The institution sends the signal that belonging cannot be selectively exploited. Those who position themselves outside the system forfeit its protection and prestige. For Meghan Markle, this represents an existential threat to her public image, which has thus far been closely tied to the royal narrative. At the same time, it is becoming clear that the conflict is not solely a personal one. The media and political observers interpret the developments as a power struggle between individual self-promotion and institutional self-assertion. Meghan Markle is frequently the focus of media coverage, often serving as a projection screen for anxieties and accusations. This escalation intensifies the pressure on Prince Harry, who finds himself increasingly isolated. The relationship itself thus becomes the arena for a larger systemic conflict. Every decision feels like a betrayal of the other side. Holding on to the marriage would mean a definitive break with the monarchy. Giving in to the palace's demands would shake the relationship to its core. In both cases, the damage is irreversible. By the end of this section, the tragedy of the situation is intensified. A private alliance has become a political symbol. The question is no longer whether the relationship can withstand the strain, but what price it will demand for its continuation. Will loyalty here become the last bastion of personal freedom, or the cause of ultimate loss? And how much closeness can remain when every decision is evaluated, weighed, and instrumentalized from the outside? The deeper the conflict escalates, the more clearly the true protagonist of this drama emerges: the institution itself. The monarchy does not act emotionally, but according to an internal logic geared toward stability, repeatability, and the preservation of power. What appears externally as harshness is understood internally as self-protection. The Prince Harry case serves as a cautionary tale about how consistently the system reacts when it perceives a threat to its authority. At the heart of this logic lies the concept of indivisibility. The monarchy tolerates no partial allegiances, no temporary use of its name, and no selective loyalty. Titles, rank, and lineage are not considered personal property, but rather a lifelong lease under clearly defined conditions. As soon as these conditions are no longer met, a mechanism kicks in that has functioned virtually unchanged for generations. This very mechanism has now become visible. The ultimatum to Prince Harry should therefore be understood less as punishment and more as a precedent. Within the palace, it is emphasized that this is not about individual retaliation, but about safeguarding institutional order. In an era of increasing media fragmentation and global scrutiny, the monarchy cannot afford any ambiguity. Any deviation would be interpreted as an invitation to imitation. The consequence is intended to deter and simultaneously create clarity. The speed with which internal structures have been mobilized is particularly striking. Supervisory boards, and legal bodies mesh together like the gears of a well-oiled machine. This efficiency signals resolve. It demonstrates that the conflict is not improvised, but rather the result of long-term observation and evaluation. Prince Harry is thus not being treated as an exception, but as a case number in an institutional review process. The role of the public is also being deliberately calculated. The decision to largely refrain from public communication is considered strategic. Silence becomes a demonstration of power. It undermines the groundwork for interpretation and prevents emotional narratives from dominating the narrative. The monarchy doesn't speak, it acts. This stance reinforces the impression of intransigence and solidifies the perception of finality. Within this framework, it becomes clear that the conflict exemplifies a larger transformation. The monarchy is undergoing a modernization process that is less visible but all the more rigorous. Adaptation here doesn't mean openness, but rather clarification. Roles are defined more clearly, and deviations are sanctioned more swiftly. The Prince Harry case marks a point where personal stories are no longer sufficient to halt institutional decisions. Critics see this as a dangerous hardening of positions. They argue that an institution that isolates itself too much could lose touch with societal developments. Proponents, on the other hand, emphasize that precisely this clarity is necessary to remain relevant in the long term. In their view, the ultimatum is not a sign of weakness, but of self-confidence. The monarchy is demonstrating its willingness to make even painful decisions to preserve its integrity. For Prince Harry, this institutional dynamic drastically reduces his room for maneuver. Personal motives, emotional arguments, or moral appeals play only a subordinate role in this system. The sole determining factor is whether the established criteria are met. This depersonalization reinforces the impression of coldness but simultaneously makes the workings of the monarchy transparent. At the end of this section, a key insight remains. The monarchy does not see itself as a family in the classical sense, but as a permanent structure with its own laws. Those who are part of it submit. Those who withdraw are consistently excluded. The Prince Harry case is therefore more than an individual drama. It is a signal to all current and future members of the House of Windsor. But how long can an institution maintain such strictness without losing its human core? And will this clear line create long-term stability or generate new fractures? While public discourse focuses on the duty of power and institutional consequences, behind the scenes the most sensitive aspect of this conflict shifts to a different level. The focus is on Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor and Lilibeth Diana Mountbatten Windsor. Their future is inextricably linked to Prince Harry's decision, and is being treated within the royal household as a separate issue, detached from personal blame or media frenzy. It is precisely here that the harshness of the situation is revealed in its quiet form. According to internal accounts, the ultimatum devotes a clearly defined section to the children's perspective. Unlike the demands made on Prince Harry, the tone here is less strict, but no less binding. The monarchy makes it clear that belonging is not defined solely by lineage. Integration, upbringing, and institutional involvement are considered indispensable prerequisites. Without these elements, even royal blood loses its symbolic function within the order of the crown. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor find themselves in a unique position. They are direct descendants of a reigning monarch, yet were born outside the United Kingdom and have not yet been integrated into the traditional structures. This fact is assessed within the palace not emotionally, but with a purely formal, documentary approach. From the institution's perspective, this creates a gray area that is not sustainable in the long term. This gray area is precisely what the institution now intends to close. The conditions formulated for the children are closely linked to Prince Harry's return. Should he choose reintegration, a clearly defined path would be open to them. This includes access to educational institutions traditionally reserved for members of the royal family, formal inclusion in the genealogical registers, and protected development within the institutional framework. Public appearances or representative duties are explicitly excluded. The focus is on stability, not visibility. Conversely, the consequences are equally clear. If Prince Harry remains outside the monarchical order, Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor and Lilibeth Diana Mountbatten Windsor would be considered private citizens. Their names would remain historically documented but would lose any active significance within the royal structure. Titles, symbolic privileges, and institutional entitlements would cease. Internally, this step is not described as a punishment but as the logical consequence of a lack of integration. Particular attention is being paid to the emotional dimension of this decision. Within the royal family, It is emphasized that this is not a measure against the children, but rather an attempt to create long-term clarity. Uncertainty, shifting narratives, and media manipulation are considered greater risks than a clearly defined status. The monarchy sees itself as responsible for avoiding future identity conflicts, even if this is perceived as harsh in the short term. This aspect has so far received little public attention, but behind closed doors, it is considered one of the decisive factors. The idea that Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilbeth Diana Mountbatten-Windsor could grow up with a fragmented identity is troubling many decision-makers. The institution prefers a clear line to an emotional but unstable solution. For Prince Harry, this significantly intensifies the internal pressure. The decision no longer concerns only his own role, but also the long-term positioning of his children. Every choice has irreversible consequences. Either they gain access to a strictly regulated but clearly defined system, or they grow up entirely outside the monarchical order with the option of returning later. This finality makes the conflict particularly difficult. At the end of this section lies an uncomfortable truth. The children's future will not be decided in talk shows or headlines, but in quiet protocols and formal decrees. The monarchy claims the right to prioritize order over emotions. Yet the question remains whether this order will meet the needs of a new generation. Is clarity a better safeguard than flexibility? And what price does a family pay when institutional logic is placed above personal bonds? The closer the deadline approaches, the more profound the silence becomes. Behind the walls of the palaces and the high hedges of Monteito, there is no visible drama, only controlled silence. It is precisely this silence that lends King Charles III Ultimatum its particular gravity. There are no public warnings, no mediators, no new offers. The institution waits, and this waiting is part of the strategy. Within the royal household, a clearly structured crisis mechanism is running in parallel. Legal preparations, administrative adjustments, and communication scenarios are ready, for both acceptance and rejection. The procedures are precisely timed. Title registers, financial structures, and protocol assignments can be rearranged within a very short time. This preparation signals that the ultimatum is not a means of coercion, but rather a decision-making template with predetermined outcomes. For Prince Harry, this phase means maximum isolation. Every action, every word could be interpreted as a signal. Therefore, nothing happens. The election is meant to appear unaffected, even if the external pressure is enormous. From the monarchy's perspective, this is crucial. The decision should not appear forced, but rather as a conscious step taken by an adult who understands the consequences. Only in this way can the eventual outcome be legitimized. Meanwhile, tension is mounting in the public eye. The media speculate, commentators analyze, and supporters and critics take positions. But all these voices have no influence on the proceedings. The monarchy has deliberately withdrawn from the public arena. It does not leave the interpretation of history to the headlines. This stance underscores the institution's claim to power, which does not justify itself, but rather executes its will. Should there be no response, a predetermined automatic process will be triggered. Formal declarations, institutional adjustments, and symbolic separations would occur almost simultaneously. Silence would be interpreted as a decision. In this scenario, Prince Harry would not only lose his remaining points of contact but also any possibility of later reassessment. The door would close definitively, not with a bang, but with administrative precision. If, however, he chooses to return under the Crown's conditions, a long and uncertain process would begin. No rehabilitation, no public role, no guarantee of acceptance. Instead, there would be control, evaluation, and indefinite observation. This scenario, too, is not a new beginning in the classical sense, but a state of probation. The monarchy offers belonging without influence, closeness without power. In both cases, there is a loss, either the loss of his institutional background or the loss of his self-chosen life path. It is precisely this inevitability that makes the moment historic. The conflict cannot be relativized, postponed, or emotionally diffuseded. It is the expression of a system asserting itself, even if it loses one of its most prominent representatives in the process. At the end of this final section lies a sobering realization. The monarchy is demonstrating its willingness to subordinate familial ties to institutional necessity. Prince Harry has thus become a symbol of a newly drawn boundary. However, it remains to be seen whether this clarity will bring long-term stability or create new alienation. Is this decision a necessary step to secure the future, or the beginning of an even deeper divide between tradition and individual freedom? King Charles II Ultimatum marks one of the most pivotal moments in the recent history of the British monarchy. A long-simmering family conflict has transformed into an institutional decision that draws clear lines and allows no gray areas. Prince Harry is at the center of this process not as a rebellious individual, but as a touchstone for the Crown's ability to enforce its will. The analysis shows that the monarchy is not primarily concerned with personal revenge, but with structural clarity. Loyalty is defined as behavior, not as an emotional bond. Those who leave the institutional framework forfeit title protection and symbolic capital. This logic is applied consistently, even if it demands sacrifices within the family. At the same time, the conflict reveals the limits of modern self-realization within traditional power structures. Prince Harry's life story exemplifies the attempt to reconcile individual freedom with institutional heritage. The ultimatum makes it clear that, from the monarchy's perspective, this connection is not sustainable in the long run. The question of the future of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor and Lilibeth Diana Mountbatten Windsor carries particular weight. Their identities are negotiated not emotionally, but in a purely formal manner. Integration or complete separation. No middle ground is foreseen. Thus, the conflict shifts from the present to the future of a new generation. In the end, what remains is an image of controlled severity. The monarchy acts quietly but decisively. Prince Harry must decide whether belonging is more important to him than autonomy. Regardless of the outcome, this decision will go down in history as a turning point. It raises a final, open question. Can a centuries-old institution secure its future by so uncompromisingly separating itself from part of its own family?